In the world of British lorries, few names carried as much weight as Leyland. They weren't just making trucks, they were making the backbone of post-war Britain. But behind all the badge pride and Union Jack paint jobs, one engine would quietly bring Leyland to its knees. Not because it was weak, not because it lacked ambition, but because it was flawed from the start. This is the real story of the TL12, an engine that promised the future and delivered a headache. Now, back in the late 1960s and early 70s, Leyland was under pressure. Competition was heating up fast, not just from British rivals like ERF and Foden, but from across the channel. Volvo, Mercedes, and Scania were starting to make their presence felt, and they were bringing in smooth, powerful diesel engines that made Leyland's old lumps look like boat anchors. The old 680 engine was solid, sure, but it was getting dated. No turbo, no real torque band, and by the time it hit a steep hill with a full load, it sounded like it was begging for retirement. Leyland needed something new, something modern, something bold. So the engineers got to work, and what they came up with was the TL12. On paper, it looked like a proper weapon, a turbocharged 6-cylinder inline diesel engine based on the old 680 block, but fitted with direct injection and a whole-set turbo. That turbo was the key selling point. It was supposed to give the TL12 the grunt and power to match its European rivals. Rated at 210 to 240 brake horsepower, it looked competitive enough. But here's where it all went sideways. The TL12 wasn't built from the ground up, it was retrofitted. Essentially, Leyland took an old block and tried to bring it up to modern spec with a bolt-on turbo and higher pressure fuel system. But the core architecture wasn't designed for that kind of stress. The result? A motor that loved to overheat, burn through head gaskets, and crack cylinder heads. And the turbo, it gave out just as quick as it spooled up. Some hauliers joked that TL12 actually stood for too late 12 breakdowns a month. Drivers were frustrated, mechanics were furious, and fleet managers were stuck in limbo. Because once you bought a batch of TL12 equipped road trains or Clydesdales, you were stuck with them. Leyland's big plan had backfired, literally in some cases, as TL12s were notorious for dropping oil and belching black smoke under load. Reliability went down the drain, and while other engines, like the Cummins L10 or the Rolls-Royce Eagle, were happily munching miles, the TL12 was in the garage again, bolts off, gasket sets out, and tempers flaring. But Leyland's problems ran deeper. The TL12 disaster wasn't just about poor design, it exposed the cracks in the whole British truck industry. Leyland didn't have the money to build a brand new engine from scratch. They were trying to compete globally with outdated tooling, squeezed budgets, and mountains of bureaucracy. Every time the TL12 failed, it wasn't just a breakdown on the M6, it was a reminder that Leyland was falling behind. And yet, for a while, they kept doubling down. TL12s kept getting stuffed into vehicles that deserved better, like the Leyland Marathon and early road trains. Lorries that had great chassis, decent cabs, and rock-solid gearboxes, but were completely let down by the power plant. Some operators ripped the TL12 out completely and swapped in Cummins or Gardner engines just to stay on the road. Others soldiered on, burning oil and cash in equal measure. There's a kind of tragic loyalty in those years. British hauliers wanted Leyland to win. These weren't just trucks, they were part of the national identity. Every yard had a few of them. Every mechanic knew the sound of a tired TL12 misfiring. But loyalty only goes so far. And when you've got a load to deliver and a deadline to hit, a truck that won't start or keeps boiling over becomes more than a nuisance. It becomes a liability. Now, to be fair, not every TL12 was a disaster. Some ran okay, especially in lighter duty setups or with proper cooling mods, but they never earned trust. Even drivers who got a good one always had that nagging fear in the back of their head. What'll give out next? The turbo? The head? The fuel pump? The engine wasn't bad in the sense that it lacked power. It was bad because it couldn't take what it promised. It teased performance, then failed to back it up. By the early 80s, it was clear the TL12 wasn't the answer. Cummins had moved in with the L10. DAF and Volvo were offering bulletproof inline sixes that ran smoother, pulled harder, and didn't explode after 80,000 miles. Leyland's last gasp was the TL12 MK2 with improved head design and better cooling. But the damage was done. Operators had lost faith. Drivers didn't want them, and the TL12 quietly disappeared from spec sheets and order books. But what really makes the TL12 a disaster isn't just the engine, it's what it symbolized. A company that had the talent and history to build the best, but lacked the cash, time, and support to pull it off. The TL12 could have been a stopgap. Instead, it became a warning sign. The TL12 might have been phased out quietly, but the mess it left behind echoed through the entire Leyland lineup. It wasn't just an engine issue, it was a trust issue. Fleet buyers who once ticked Leyland boxes without blinking were now second-guessing every spec sheet. Workshops were fed up, drivers started requesting other makes, and the second-hand market, TL12-powered trucks became the slowest sellers in any yard. Buyers knew they'd be stuck with something unreliable and under-supported. One of the biggest victims was the Leyland Marathon, a truck that should have been a game-changer. When it launched in the early 70s, the Marathon was Leyland's bold attempt to shake off the old-school image and go toe-to-toe with the growing European competition. It had the looks, the weight ratings, and the promise of modernization. But when it came out fitted with the TL12 as standard, it immediately ran into trouble. Operators expected a strong, dependable haulier. What they got was a sleek cab bolted to an engine that wouldn't stop overheating. Many marathons were pulled from long-haul work and relegated to light duties, purely because the engine couldn't handle consistent motorway abuse. Then came the Leyland Road Train, which had the makings of a brilliant all-rounder. It was tough, had a good cab for its time, and paired well with modern trailers. But again, early variants were offered with the TL12, and once word spread, buyers started holding out for Cummins-equipped models instead. That became a recurring theme. If you walked into a dealership in the late 70s and asked what engine was fitted, if the answer was TL12, you probably turned around. Some operators flat out refused to purchase TL12-powered anything, no matter the price cut. And while we're at it, let's talk about what should have been used instead. The Rolls-Royce Eagle, for example, was a completely different beast. It had the engineering pedigree, the torque curve to pull full loads all day long, and crucially, it didn't fry itself after every long climb. Foden knew this and stuck with Rolls-Royce engines for years. ERF did too, later moving toward Cummins when reliability and serviceability became more important. These engines weren't perfect, but compared to the TL12, they were a different league. You also had the Gardner 6 LXB, an engine that didn't shout but quietly outlived everything around it. It didn't have the horsepower headline, but it pulled like a tractor and lasted for 500,000 miles if you treated it right. Hauliers with mixed fleets soon realized that keeping a few Gardners on the road cost them far less than dealing with the constant failures of TL12. It's no coincidence that as Leyland pushed the TL12 harder, more operators jumped ship to makes like ERF or even second-hand Volvos just to get away from the mounting repair bills. Eventually, even Leyland couldn't ignore it. They tried to save face by offering a revised 12 Mark II, slight improvements, minor upgrades, better cooling systems, but it was too late. The damage was done. The name had been ruined. Like a restaurant with one too many food poisoning cases, the word had spread, and nobody wanted to risk it. The real nail in the coffin came when Cummins offered the L10 in the UK market. Suddenly, there was a modern, powerful, fuel-efficient engine available off the shelf, with a global support network and actual reliability. It was game over. By the mid-1980s, Leyland was limping. The TL12 fiasco had sucked resources, damaged their brand, and put them on the back foot just as the truck world was globalizing. Other British builders like Seddon Atkinson and ERF had at least moved quickly to outsourced engines. Leyland clung to their in-house power until they had no choice but to let it go. And even then, the hangover remained. The whole debacle sent a message to buyers. If Leyland couldn't get their engines right, what else were they cutting corners on? When Leyland trucks eventually merged into DAF and other pieces of the empire were sold off, a big chunk of that decision-making was tied to their declining competitiveness, and that trail leads straight back to the TL12. The engine didn't just ruin individual trucks, it helped collapse confidence in Leyland as a whole. Even today, in scrapyards and vintage lorry meets, you'll occasionally find a TL12 survivor, maybe tucked into a dusty road train, or sat under a tarpaulin in the corner of someone's yard. And you can guarantee whoever owns it has a story, a cracked head, a blown turbo, or the time it gave up halfway up Shap Fell in January and left them stranded for hours. These engines are part of the history, but not the proud kind. The cautionary kind. What makes it all sting even more is that Leyland had the right ingredients. They had brilliant engineers, solid frames, decent cabs, but the decision to modernize the old 680 block instead of starting fresh cost them everything. The TL12 should have been the next big leap. Instead, it dragged the brand down with it. The TL12 wasn't just an engine, it was a warning, a signal that even Britain's biggest names weren't untouchable. What began as a turbocharged promise turned into a ticking time bomb parked square in Leyland's history. For every haulier who wrestled with its breakdowns and every driver left stranded at the side of the M6, the TL12 became more than a failure. It became a lesson, one that came too late to save the badge.